My son-in-law mocked me for being broke. He had no idea I secretly bought his company. Silence was sweet. The crystal chandelier cast dancing shadows across the mahogany dining table as I watched my son-in-law's lips curl into that familiar, condescending smile. 23 years I'd been watching that same expression, and tonight, it would be the last time I'd let it slide. "You know, Emily," Mark said, his voice carrying that theatrical tone he reserved for his most cutting remarks. "Your father really ought to think about retirement. I mean, seriously, how much longer can a man live on pennies and pride?" The wine glass trembled slightly in his manicured fingers as he gestured toward me, and I noticed how the expensive Bordeaux caught the light. Probably cost more than what he assumed I spent on groceries in a month. The irony wasn't lost on me. "Mark, please," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible above the soft classical music playing from the hidden speakers. Her knuckles were white where she gripped her napkin, and I could see the familiar flush of embarrassment creeping up her neck. But Mark was just getting started. He never could resist an audience, and tonight's dinner party provided him with the perfect stage. 6 of his most important business associates sat around our table. Well, his table now, since he'd insisted on hosting at their sprawling suburban mansion. No, Emily. Let me finish." He held up his hand with the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "Thomas, I'm genuinely curious. How do you manage it? I mean, we all know about your situation. Patching up old shoes, clipping coupons, shopping at those discount stores. It's admirable in its own way, I suppose." The guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Margaret Henderson, the wife of Mark's biggest client, studied her plate with sudden fascination. James Morrison, the company's lead investor, cleared his throat and reached for his water glass. They all knew this was uncomfortable territory, but none of them would risk Mark's displeasure by speaking up. I felt Emily's eyes on me, desperate and pleading. She wanted me to defend myself, to show some fire, to prove that her father wasn't the broken-down old man her husband painted me to be. But I simply smiled, that same mild, patient smile I'd perfected over the years, and carefully folded my hands in my lap. "I manage just fine, Mark," I said quietly, my voice steady as stone. "A man learns to make do with what he has." Mark's laugh was sharp and bitter. "Make do? Thomas, you're 72 years old. You drive a car from the Clinton administration. Your clothes look like they came from a church donation box. When was the last time you treated yourself to anything? When was the last time you felt like you had real choices in life?" The words hung in the air like smoke. I watched as Emily's face crumpled slightly, as if each of her husband's barbs was finding its mark in her heart instead of mine. She loved me, and Mark's cruelty toward me was killing her slowly, piece by piece. What Mark didn't understand, what none of them could possibly understand, was that his words didn't sting me at all. They bounced off me like rain off a well-oiled coat. Because while he sat there in his $1,000 suit, drunk on wine and his own perceived superiority, I was thinking about the meeting I'd had just 3 days ago with my financial advisor. "The acquisition is proceeding exactly as planned, Mr. Grant," Patricia Williams had said, sliding the folder across her desk. "Ellis Technologies has no idea what's happening. By next month, you'll own controlling interest." But I couldn't think about that now. Not with Emily looking at me with those wounded eyes, not with Mark's friends pretending they couldn't hear the venom in his voice. "You know what I think, Thomas?" Mark continued, warming to his theme. He was in full performance mode now, feeding off the uncomfortable energy in the room. "I think you've given up. I think you've accepted being less than. And maybe that's fine for you, but it breaks my heart to see what it's doing to Emily." Now he'd crossed the line. I felt my jaw tighten almost imperceptibly, felt that old familiar fire kindle in my chest. But I didn't let it show. Instead, I took a slow sip of water and met his gaze steadily. "I appreciate your concern for my daughter's well-being, Mark." "Concern?" He laughed again, and this time several of the guests actually winced. "Thomas, it's not concern. It's reality. Emily deserves better than having to make excuses for her father's circumstances. She deserves to hold her head high, to be proud of her family. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the classical music seemed to fade into the background. I could hear the grandfather clock in the hallway ticking, could hear someone's shallow breathing, could hear the soft clink of silverware as nervous hands fidgeted with dinner settings. Emily's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back quickly. She'd learned, over the years of her marriage to Mark, to hide her emotions. It was a survival skill in this house. I reached over and gently patted her hand. "It's all right, sweetheart," I said softly. "Your husband is entitled to his opinions." Mark's smile widened, triumphant. He thought he'd won. He thought he'd successfully humiliated the old man in front of his important friends, thought he'd proven his superiority once and for all. If only he knew that his words were actually music to my ears. Every insult, every sneer, every casual dismissal only reminded me of the beautiful irony that was about to unfold. In just a few weeks, this arrogant man who saw me as nothing more than a burden would discover exactly who held the real power. But for now, I simply smiled and let him have his moment. After all, it would be his last. The drive home from that disastrous dinner party took me through the quiet streets of Millfield, past the modest duplex I'd called home for the past 8 years. Mark was right about one thing: my 1998 Honda Civic had seen better days. The paint was faded, the passenger seat had a small tear that I'd never bothered to fix, and yes, it made that peculiar rattling sound every time I hit a pothole. What Mark didn't know was that I chose to drive this car. As I pulled into my narrow driveway, I sat for a moment in the darkness, letting the engine tick as it cooled. The house looked exactly like what it was: a simple, 2-bedroom rental in a working-class neighborhood. Chain-link fence, small front yard with grass that needed cutting, porch light that flickered when the wind blew too hard. To anyone driving by it screamed, "Man down on his luck!" Perfect. I climbed the 3 wooden steps to my front door, each one creaking under my weight just like they had for nearly a decade. Inside, the living room was sparse but clean. A worn leather armchair that had belonged to my father, a small television I'd bought at a garage sale, bookshelves made from cinder blocks and old boards. The kind of setup that would make Mark physically uncomfortable. But it was in my bedroom, in the bottom drawer of an old oak dresser, that the real story lived. I pulled out the thick manila folder and spread its contents across my bed. Bank statements, investment portfolios, property deeds, all the evidence of a life Mark could never imagine. The numbers were staggering, even to me sometimes. $47 million in carefully diversified investments. 3 commercial properties in downtown Chicago that generated steady rental income. A stake in 6 different companies that had grown exponentially over the past decade. It hadn't always been this way. When Margaret, my dear Margaret, was still alive, we'd lived openly prosperous lives. 2 successful restaurants, a catering business, a beautiful home on the lake. We'd been the kind of couple other people envied, the kind who took European vacations and drove luxury cars without thinking twice about the cost. But when the cancer took her 5 years ago, everything changed. I remembered the night she died, holding her hand in that sterile hospital room while machines beeped around us. She'd made me promise something that seemed strange at the time but made perfect sense now. "Thomas," she'd whispered, her voice barely audible, "don't let them see how much you have. People change when they know about money. Even family. Especially family." At first, I thought grief was making her paranoid. But as the months passed and I watched how differently people treated me, how much more genuine they seemed when they thought I was struggling, I began to understand her wisdom. Mark's true colors emerged almost immediately after the funeral. Before Margaret's death, he'd been respectful, even deferential. But when he assumed I was just another elderly widower living on Social Security, his mask slipped. The condescension started slowly, little comments about my situation, offers to help with bills I didn't need help paying, suggestions that maybe I should consider moving somewhere more affordable. So I sold everything visible. The house, the cars, the restaurants. I let people assume the medical bills had wiped me out, let them think I was hanging on by a thread. Meanwhile, I was quietly reinvesting everything, building an empire that existed only on paper and in bank accounts scattered across 3 states. The simplicity of my new life wasn't a burden, it was freedom. No more cocktail parties where people only talk to you because of your net worth. No more wondering if someone liked you or your wallet. No more watching people like Mark calculate your value based on your possessions. I learned to find joy in small things. Saturday morning coffee at the diner where Stella knew I liked my eggs over easy. Afternoon walks through the park where kids played without caring what kind of car their grandfather drove. Evening phone calls with Emily where we talked about books and dreams instead of stock portfolios and business deals. But I wasn't naive. I'd spent those quiet years doing more than just soul-searching. I'd been watching, learning, planning. When you're invisible to people like Mark, you hear things they never intended to share. Conversations at family gatherings about cash flow problems. Worried phone calls Emily thought I couldn't overhear. Business associates who spoke freely in front of the harmless old man, who couldn't possibly understand their complicated corporate maneuvering. That's how I'd learned about Ellis Technologies' vulnerabilities 6 months ago. Mark's company was bigger than it was stable, more impressive than it was profitable. Leverage to the hilt, dependent on a few major contracts that could disappear overnight, managed by a man whose ego wrote checks his business acumen couldn't cash. So I'd started making quiet inquiries. Shell companies, trusted intermediaries, legal structures so complex that even Mark's own lawyers wouldn't be able to trace them back to me. Every share purchase carefully calculated to stay below the radar. Every transaction designed to look like the routine investments of pension funds and institutional buyers. The beautiful part was that Mark's arrogance made him blind to the danger. He was so convinced of his own superiority, so certain that a man like me could never threaten him, that he never thought to look closer at the mysterious new investors circling his company like sharks. As I gathered the papers back into their folder, I allowed myself a small smile. Tomorrow, I'd call Patricia Williams again. The final pieces were almost in place. Soon, very soon, Mark would learn what real power looked like. And it wouldn't be wearing an expensive suit. The grandfather clock in my hallway chimed midnight as I settled into my father's old leather chair with a cup of coffee and my laptop. This had become my routine over the past 6 months, days spent maintaining the facade of a struggling retiree, nights spent orchestrating the most elaborate chess game of my life. My dining room table looked like a war room. Spreadsheets covered every inch of the surface, marked with colored pens and sticky notes. Corporate organizational charts, financial reports, market analyses, all the ammunition I needed to take down an empire. To anyone peering through my windows, it might have looked like the desperate research of an old man trying to understand a world that had passed him by. They couldn't have been more wrong. I opened my encrypted laptop and pulled up the secure messaging system Patricia Williams had set up for our communications. 3 new messages waited for me, each one a small victory in my carefully orchestrated campaign. Brookstone Investments has agreed to sell their 8% stake. The first message read. Price point exactly as discussed. Transaction will be completed through Meridian Holdings as planned. I allowed myself a satisfied nod. Brookstone had been reluctant at first, but when I'd had Patricia hint that a major corporate restructuring was coming to Ellis Technologies, they'd been eager to get out while the getting was good. They had no idea they were selling directly to their company's future owner. The second message was even better. Morrison's pension fund is liquidating their position. 12% stake available immediately. Recommend moving quickly. James Morrison, the same man who'd sat at Mark's dinner table 3 nights ago, nodding politely while my son-in-law humiliated me. His own pension fund was about to hand me the keys to Mark's kingdom, and he didn't even know it. The irony was delicious. I picked up my secure phone and dialed Patricia's private number. She answered on the second ring, despite the late hour. Thomas, you saw the messages? I did. Execute both transactions immediately. Route Morrison's purchase through Continental Asset Management, Brookstone's through Meridian. I want 0 connection between them. That'll put you at 43% ownership, Patricia said, and I could hear papers rustling on her end. You're 3 percentage points away from controlling interest. Good. What about the board situation? Exactly as you predicted. Helena Crawford is getting nervous about the quarterly projections. Word is she's been having private conversations with other board members about Mark's leadership. The Yamamoto contract falling through last month didn't help his position. I'd been counting on Helena's pragmatism. She'd been on Ellis Technologies' board for 8 years, and she had a reputation for putting profits over personalities. Mark's charm had carried him far, but Helena Crawford cared about numbers, not smooth talk. How quickly can you arrange a meeting with Helena? I can have something set up by Friday. Casual lunch, just Patricia Williams from Hamilton Financial Group meeting with a potential board member about investment opportunities. She doesn't need to know who I really represent yet. Patricia was worth every penny of her substantial fees. Former SEC investigator, Harvard MBA, and the kind of strategic mind that could navigate corporate acquisition laws while blindfolded. More importantly, she understood the psychology of what we were doing. This isn't about revenge, I told her during our first meeting. This is about justice. And about protecting my daughter's future. She'd studied me across her mahogany desk for a long moment before nodding. I've seen a lot of corporate takeovers, Mr. Grant. Most of them are about greed or ego. This is different. I'm in. Now, 6 months later, we were so close I could taste it. I pulled up Ellis Technologies' latest quarterly report on my screen. The numbers told a story that Mark was desperately trying to hide from his investors. Revenue was down 18% from the previous year. 3 major contracts had fallen through in the past 6 months. The company's debt-to-equity ratio was climbing toward dangerous territory. But Mark kept projecting confidence, kept promising the board that the next big deal was just around the corner. He'd built his entire reputation on being a closer, a man who could charm his way into any boardroom and emerge with a signed contract. The problem was that charm couldn't fix fundamental business problems forever. My phone buzzed with a text message from Emily. "Dad, are you awake?" "Having trouble sleeping." I immediately called her back. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" Her voice was quiet, tired. "It's Mark. He's been so angry lately. Stressed about work, I think. He came home tonight and just exploded. About dishes in the sink, about me not supporting him enough, about you." My grip tightened on the phone. "About me?" "He said having dinner with you the other night was embarrassing. Said it made him look bad in front of his business partners, having a father-in-law who lives like you do. He wants me to talk to you about maybe moving to one of those senior communities. Says it would be better for everyone." The rage that rose in my chest was swift and hot. Not because of Mark's insults, I'd heard worse, but because of what this was doing to Emily. My brilliant, kind daughter who'd once dreamed of being a teacher, who now spent her days walking on eggshells around a man who grew crueler with each passing month. "Emily," I said carefully, "you know you don't have to stay in a situation that makes you unhappy." "I know, Dad. I know. It's just complicated. The house, the finances, everything's so tangled up. And he's not always like this. When things are going well at work, he can be the man I married. But things weren't going well at work. And they were about to get much worse. Sweetheart, I want you to remember something. You're stronger than you know, and you're never truly trapped. No matter what happens, no matter how complicated things seem, there's always a way forward." After we hung up, I sat in the darkness for a long time, staring at the numbers on my screen. This wasn't just about business anymore. It wasn't just about teaching Mark a lesson about humility and respect. This was about giving my daughter her life back. I opened a new message to Patricia. "Accelerate the timeline. I want controlling interest within 2 weeks. Whatever it costs." The game was almost over, and Mark Ellis didn't even know he was playing. 2 weeks later, I was sitting on my front porch with a cup of coffee and the morning newspaper when Emily's car pulled into my driveway. It was barely 8 o'clock, and she was supposed to be at her book club meeting across town. The fact that she was here instead, with red-rimmed eyes and yesterday's clothes, told me everything I needed to know. She climbed the porch steps slowly, like each one required enormous effort. When she finally looked at me, I saw something in her face that made my heart break, the hollow expression of a woman who was disappearing piece by piece. "He doesn't know I'm here," she said, settling into the old wicker chair beside me. "He thinks I'm at Sarah's house discussing The Great Gatsby and drinking tea like a proper wife." I handed her my coffee without a word. She wrapped her hands around the warm mug and stared out at the quiet street where children were riding bicycles and neighbors were walking dogs, normal people living normal lives. "Tell me what happened," I said gently. "It was about you again," she whispered. "It's always about you lately. Last night his business partner called with some bad news about a contract, and Mark just exploded. Started ranting about how everything in his life was falling apart, how he had to deal with failure everywhere he looked." She paused, her voice catching. "He said having you as a father-in-law was like carrying dead weight, that your poverty reflects on him, makes him look unsuccessful." I felt that familiar cold anger settle in my chest, but I kept my voice calm. "What did you say?" I couldn't stay quiet anymore, Dad. I just couldn't. Emily's hands trembled slightly around the mug. "I told him that you've never asked him for anything, never been anything but respectful to him. I said that a man's worth isn't measured by his bank account, and that you have more dignity in your little finger than he has in his entire body." Despite everything, I felt a surge of pride. My daughter still had fight in her, still had the moral compass Margaret, and I had tried to instill in her. How did he respond? Emily's laugh was bitter and hollow. He looked at me like I was insane. Said dignity? "Emily, your father shops at thrift stores and clips coupons. He drives a car that should have been scrapped years ago. He lives in a rental house that's falling apart. What exactly is dignified about giving up on life?" She set the coffee mug down on the small table between our chairs and turned to face me fully. "But you know what the worst part was? The way he said it. Like you were some kind of embarrassment he had to endure. Like you were." She struggled for the words. "Like I was less than human." I finished quietly. "Yes." Tears started flowing down her cheeks. "And when I told him he was being cruel, he said I'm being honest. Your father is weak. He's given up. A real man doesn't live like that, accepting scraps and handouts. A real man fights for something better." The words hung between us like a physical presence. I could picture Mark's face as he said them, that combination of disgust and superiority that I'd seen so many times over the years. But now it wasn't just affecting me. It was destroying my daughter. "What did you say to that?" Emily wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. I said, "Maybe the difference is that my father understands what really matters in life, and you've forgotten." And then... She paused, drawing a shaky breath. Then he laughed. Actually laughed, Dad. And he said, "What really matters? Being a burden? Having nothing to show for 72 years of life? If that's what matters to you, Emily, then maybe you've forgotten what it means to have ambition." I reached over and took her hand. Her wedding ring, the same ring Mark had presented to her with such ceremony 8 years ago, caught the morning sunlight. And then what happened? I couldn't look at him anymore. I went to our bedroom and locked the door. He spent the rest of the night in his study, probably drinking and feeling sorry for himself. This morning, he left for work without saying a word to me. Just grabbed his briefcase and walked out like I was invisible. We sat in silence for a few minutes, watching a neighbor across the street water her garden. Mrs. Patterson waved at us, and we both waved back automatically. Normal gestures in an increasingly abnormal situation. "Emily," I said finally, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer." She looked at me expectantly. "When you married Mark, what did you see in him? What made you fall in love with him?" She was quiet for a long moment, considering. "He was confident. Successful. He made me feel like I was part of something important, something bigger than myself. He had plans, dreams, ambition." She paused. "He made me laugh. He was charming and attentive, and he seemed to genuinely care about making me happy. And now? Now I feel like I'm married to a stranger. Someone who measures everything, including people, by their price tag. Someone who thinks kindness is weakness and respect has to be earned through wealth. She looked at me with those sad eyes. Sometimes I wonder who really understands dignity, him or you. And that question keeps me awake at night because I already know the answer. I squeezed her hand gently. You know, sweetheart, sometimes people reveal who they really are when they think they have nothing to lose. Or when they think they have everything to lose. What do you mean? I almost told her then. Almost explained that in less than 72 hours, Mark's entire world was going to shift on its axis. Almost revealed that the man who mocked me for being weak was about to discover what real strength looked like. Instead, I just smiled and patted her hand. I mean that the truth has a way of coming out eventually. And when it does, people have to choose who they really want to be. Emily stayed for another hour, and we talked about books and gardening and her mother's old recipes, anything except Mark and his cruelty. When she finally left, she seemed lighter somehow, as if sharing the burden had made it easier to carry. As I watched her drive away, I pulled out my secure phone and sent Patricia a simple message. Execute final phase immediately. Time to end this. Mark wanted to know what a real man looked like. He was about to find out. The first crack in Mark's facade appeared exactly 1 week later, though he tried his best to hide it from everyone, including himself. I was at the downtown diner where I ate lunch twice a week, occupying my usual corner booth with a clear view of the street, when I saw him through the window. Mark was standing outside the First National Bank building, his phone pressed to his ear, gesturing frantically with his free hand. Even from 50 feet away, I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he kept running his fingers through his hair. From my vantage point, I watched him pace back and forth on the sidewalk for nearly 10 minutes. Whatever conversation he was having, it wasn't going well. When he finally hung up, he stood perfectly still for a moment, staring at his phone like it had betrayed him. Then he threw it against the brick wall. The device shattered into pieces, and Mark immediately looked around to see if anyone had witnessed his moment of weakness. His eyes swept past the diner window, but he didn't see me sitting in the shadows. He quickly gathered the broken pieces, smoothed his tie, and walked into the bank with the forced confidence of a man trying to convince himself that everything was under control. But I knew better. I'd been watching Ellis Technologies' stock price all morning, and the numbers told a story Mark couldn't spin away. Down 12% since opening, with trading volume 3 times higher than normal. The financial blogs were starting to pick up on the company's troubles, and Wall Street had a way of smelling weakness from miles away. My secure phone buzzed with a text from Patricia. Morrison called emergency board meeting for Friday. Confidence vote scheduled. Helena Crawford confirms she'll be attending. Perfect. Patricia had done her job beautifully. Helena now knew exactly who was behind the mysterious new investments in Ellis Technologies, and she was ready to move when the time came. That evening, Emily called me just as I was finishing my simple dinner of soup and grilled cheese. Dad, can you come over? I need someone here tonight. Of course, sweetheart. Is everything all right? Mark came home an hour ago, and he's not himself. He's pacing around the house, making phone calls, drinking scotch like it's water. Something's wrong at work, something big, but he won't tell me what it is. 20 minutes later, I was sitting in Mark and Emily's pristine living room, surrounded by the expensive furniture and artwork that Mark loved to show off. The house felt like a museum, beautiful but cold, impressive but somehow hollow. Mark emerged from his study looking like he'd aged 5 years in the past week. His usually perfect hair was disheveled, his shirt was wrinkled, and there were dark circles under his eyes. When he saw me, his expression flickered between annoyance and resignation. "Thomas," he said, attempting his usual condescending tone but failing to hide the strain in his voice. "I didn't know Emily had invited you over." "I asked him to come," Emily said firmly. "I was worried about you." Mark poured himself another scotch, his fourth since I'd arrived, by my count, and settled into his leather recliner. For a moment, he seemed almost vulnerable, like the successful executive mask had slipped completely. "The market's been challenging lately," he said, more to his glass than to us. "Investors are getting nervous about everything. The slightest hint of trouble and they scatter like roaches when you turn on the lights." "What kind of trouble?" I asked innocently. Mark's laugh was sharp and bitter. "The Yamamoto deal fell through last month. $3 million we were counting on, gone because they decided to go with a more established company. Then Henderson pulled out of the Chicago project, said the risk assessment didn't look favorable. And now," he took a long drink, "now there are rumors flying around that some major investor is buying up shares, planning some kind of hostile takeover." I maintained my expression of polite interest, but inside, my heart was racing. "That sounds concerning." "Concerning?" Mark's voice rose slightly. "Thomas, it's a disaster. Someone's been quietly acquiring stock for months, and nobody knows who it is. They're using shell companies, offshore accounts, legal structures so complex that even our attorneys can't trace them. Whoever's behind this, they're smart, professional, and they're close to having enough shares to control the entire company." Emily leaned forward in her chair. "But surely your board won't let that happen. You built that company, Mark. They know what you've accomplished." Mark's smile was bitter. "Boards care about one thing, profit. And lately, Ellis Technologies hasn't been delivering the kind of returns our shareholders expect. If this mystery investor can promise better performance..." He shrugged helplessly. "What about your other partners? Can't they help? Morrison's pension fund just sold their entire stake. 12% of the company, gone overnight. Helena Crawford's been asking pointed questions about our quarterly projections. James Henderson won't even return my calls." Mark stood up abruptly and began pacing. "It's like watching your entire life's work crumble in slow motion." I watched him carefully, this man who had spent years mocking me for my failures. Now he was facing real failure, the kind that couldn't be hidden behind expensive suits and arrogant speeches. And he was terrified. "I'm sure things will work out," I said gently. "Sometimes when everything seems lost, the solution is closer than we think." Mark stopped pacing and looked at me with barely concealed irritation. "Thomas, I appreciate the optimism, but you don't understand how these things work. This isn't about hoping for the best or keeping a positive attitude. This is about power, money, and corporate warfare. The kind of world where nice guys finish last and weakness gets you destroyed." He gestured around the room at his expensive belongings. "You see all this? The house, the cars, the lifestyle? It could all be gone in a matter of weeks. And then what? Then I'll be just another failed businessman, just another guy who had everything and lost it all." The irony was almost overwhelming. Here was Mark, terrified of becoming exactly what he thought I was, a man with nothing to show for his life. What he didn't realize was that in a matter of days, our positions would be completely reversed. "Mark," I said quietly, "a man's worth isn't measured by what he owns. It's measured by how he treats the people who matter to him." Mark stared at me for a long moment, and for just an instant, I thought I saw something flicker in his eyes, maybe recognition, maybe regret. But then his familiar sneer returned. "Spare me the philosophy, Thomas. Unlike some people, I can't afford to be satisfied with having nothing. Some of us actually fight to build something meaningful with our lives." Emily's face flushed with anger. "Mark, that's enough." But I held up my hand gently. "It's all right, sweetheart." I looked directly at Mark. "You're right about one thing, some of us do fight to build something meaningful. The question is, what exactly are we building, and at what cost?" Mark turned away dismissively. "I need to make some calls. Crisis management doesn't handle itself." As he disappeared back into his study, Emily looked at me with tears in her eyes. "I'm sorry, Dad. The stress is making him even worse than usual." I patted her hand reassuringly. "Don't worry, sweetheart. I have a feeling his stress is about to be resolved very soon." If only she knew how right I was. The boardroom of Ellis Technologies occupied the entire 32nd floor of downtown's newest glass tower. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding view of the city below, and the polished mahogany table could seat 20 people comfortably. It was the kind of room designed to intimidate, to remind everyone present that important decisions were made here by important people. Today, it would witness the most important decision in the company's 15-year history. I arrived 30 minutes early, taking the elevator to the 32nd floor with the same calm I'd maintained throughout this entire process. The receptionist, a young woman named Jennifer who'd been nothing but polite during my previous visits as an investment consultant, smiled warmly as I approached her desk. "Good morning, Mr. Grant. The board is assembling in conference room A. Can I get you anything? Coffee? Water?" "Coffee would be perfect, Jennifer. Thank you." I made my way down the marble-floored hallway, past the expensive artwork and corporate awards that Mark had spent years accumulating. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was about to take control of a company housed in a building more luxurious than anywhere I'd ever worked, using money Mark didn't even know I possessed. Helena Crawford was already seated at the far end of the conference table, reviewing a thick folder of documents. She looked up as I entered, and her expression was carefully neutral, the face of a woman who'd spent decades navigating corporate politics. "Mr. Grant," she said with a slight nod, "I trust you're prepared for today's proceedings?" "Completely prepared, Helena. Thank you for your support in making this happen." She studied me for a moment with sharp gray eyes. "I have to admit, Thomas, may I call you Thomas? This is one of the more unusual situations I've encountered in 23 years of board service. When Patricia first approached me about your identity, I didn't believe her. I can understand that. A man living in a rental duplex, driving a 27-year-old car, shopping at discount stores, who secretly controls a $47 million investment portfolio and is orchestrating a corporate takeover." She shook her head slightly. "It's either brilliant or completely insane. Perhaps a little of both." Other board members began filing in. James Morrison, looking nervous and constantly checking his phone. Patricia Williams, playing her role as my financial advisor perfectly. Robert Chen from the company's legal department. Sarah Martinez, the CFO who'd been growing increasingly concerned about the company's direction. Each of them nodded politely as they took their seats, most having no idea that the unassuming elderly man in the simple gray suit was about to change everything they thought they knew about power dynamics. At exactly 10 a.m., Mark strode into the room with the confidence of a man who believed he still controlled his own destiny. He'd clearly spent extra time on his appearance this morning. Fresh haircut, perfectly pressed suit, expensive cologne that announced his presence before he even spoke. But I could see the tension in his shoulders, the slight tremor in his hands as he arranged his papers. "Good morning, everyone," he said, his voice carrying its usual authoritative tone. "I know this emergency meeting was called on short notice, but given the recent market volatility and the rumors circulating about hostile takeover attempts, I felt it was important that we address these concerns head-on." His eyes swept around the table, lingering briefly on each face, trying to read the room. When his gaze reached me, he stopped completely. "I'm sorry," he said, his confident mask slipping slightly, "but I don't believe we've been introduced. Are you with one of our consulting firms?" The silence that followed was profound. You could hear the air conditioning humming, could hear someone's pen tapping nervously against the table, could hear the distant sound of traffic 32 floors below. Helena Crawford cleared her throat. "Mark, I'd like you to meet Thomas Grant. He's the majority shareholder of Ellis Technologies as of yesterday afternoon." The words hit Mark like a physical blow. His face went completely white, then flushed red, then white again. He gripped the back of his chair so hard his knuckles went bloodless. "I'm sorry, what did you just say?" "Mr. Grant now owns 51% of the company's outstanding shares," Patricia Williams said, consulting her folder. "The acquisition was completed through a series of purchases over the past 6 months, all properly documented and filed with the appropriate regulatory agencies." Mark's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. His eyes darted from face to face around the table, searching for some sign that this was an elaborate joke. That's impossible. He's nobody. He's broke. His voice trailed off as the full implications hit him. I could see the exact moment when recognition dawned, when he realized that the pathetic old man he'd spent years mocking was sitting at the head of his boardroom table, holding his entire future in weathered hands. "Thomas Grant," he whispered, and my name sounded different coming from his lips now. Not dismissive or condescending, but fearful. Shocked. You're Emily's father." "Yes, Mark. I am. But you live in, you drive, you shop at." He couldn't finish any of the sentences. His entire worldview was crumbling in real time, and everyone in the room could see it happening. Robert Chen leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Ellis, perhaps you'd like to take a seat? We have several important matters to discuss." Mark sank into his chair like a man in a trance. His usual commanding presence had evaporated completely, replaced by the hollow stare of someone trying to process an impossible reality. "I don't understand," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "How is this possible? You have nothing. You are nothing. I've seen how you live." For the first time since entering the room, I spoke directly to him. "Mark, you've spent 8 years telling me that a man's worth is measured by what he owns, by the impression he makes, by the power he wields. Today, you're going to learn what those things actually look like." I opened my own folder and placed a single sheet of paper in front of him. "These are the terms of your severance package. You have 10 minutes to review them before we proceed with the vote on new leadership." Mark stared at the document without seeing it, his hands shaking slightly. Around the table, board members shifted uncomfortably, witnessing the complete destruction of a man's ego in real time. The most beautiful part wasn't his shock or his fear. It was the silence that followed, the same kind of silence I'd endured for years while he mocked and belittled me. Only now, the silence belonged to him. And just like he told me so many times before, it was absolutely deafening. The 10 minutes I'd given Mark to review his severance package stretched like hours. He sat frozen in his chair, staring at the document without really reading it, his breathing shallow and irregular. The other board members maintained their professional composure, but I could see the fascination in their eyes. They were witnessing something unprecedented, the complete reversal of a power dynamic they'd all taken for granted. Finally, Helena Crawford broke the silence. "Mark, do you have any questions about the terms Mr. Grant has offered?" Mark's head snapped up as if he'd forgotten there were other people in the room. "Questions?" His voice cracked slightly. "You want to know if I have questions?" He looked around the table with wild eyes, searching for an ally, someone who would speak up for him, remind everyone of his years of service, his contributions to the company's growth. But corporate boards were pragmatic entities, and sentiment had no place in business decisions. "This is insane," he said, his voice growing stronger as desperation replaced shock. "You can't seriously be considering this. I built this company from nothing. 15 years of my life, 15 years of 60-hour weeks, of sacrificing everything for Ellis Technologies. And you're going to hand it over to him?" He pointed at me with a trembling finger, and I could see him struggling to reconcile the man he'd dismissed as worthless with the reality sitting across from him. "Mark," Sarah Martinez said gently, "the board's primary responsibility is to the shareholders. Mr. Grant now represents the majority of those shareholders. This isn't personal, it's business." "Not personal?" Mark's laugh was high and bitter. "Of course it's personal. This is revenge, pure and simple. He's been planning this for months, maybe years, waiting for his chance to destroy me." All eyes turned to me. It was my moment to speak, to explain my motivations, to justify what I'd done. The old Thomas might have offered platitudes about business being business, might have tried to soften the blow with reassuring words about Mark's future prospects. But I'd learned something important over the past 8 years of enduring his contempt. Sometimes silence was the most powerful response of all. I simply looked at him across the polished mahogany table, my expression calm and steady. I didn't defend myself, didn't explain my actions, didn't offer any words of comfort or justification. I just met his panicked gaze with the same quiet dignity I'd maintained through years of his insults. The silence stretched between us, thick and heavy. Mark's face grew redder as he waited for me to say something, anything that would give him something to argue against. "Well?" he demanded finally. "Aren't you going to say something? Aren't you going to gloat? This is your big moment, Thomas. The broken-down old man finally gets his revenge on the successful son-in-law. Don't you want to savor it?" Still, I said nothing. I folded my hands in my lap, the same gesture I had made countless times at his dinner parties while he mocked my clothes, my car, my lifestyle. But now the gesture carried a different weight entirely. "Say something!" Mark slammed his hand on the table, making several people jump. "For God's sake, just say something!" Robert Chin cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Mark, perhaps we should proceed with the vote on corporate leadership. The board has a fiduciary responsibility." "No!" Mark stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "I want to hear from him. I want to hear from the man who's been plotting my destruction while pretending to be some harmless old fool." He leaned forward, placing both hands on the table, his face inches from mine. "You want to know what I think, Thomas? I think you're pathetic. I think this whole elaborate scheme is the desperate act of a man who's never accomplished anything meaningful in his entire life. You had to tear down someone else's success because you couldn't build your own." The venom in his voice was extraordinary, even for Mark. Years of suppressed resentment were pouring out of him, all the frustration and fear he'd been hiding behind his arrogant facade. "You think owning this company makes you powerful? You think having money in the bank makes you important? You're still the same sad old man who clips coupons and shops at thrift stores. Money doesn't change who you are at your core." I could see Patricia Williams shifting uncomfortably in her seat, probably preparing to intervene. Helena Crawford's face was a mask of professional concern. But I remained perfectly still, letting Mark's words wash over me like rain. "And Emily," he continued, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper, "what do you think this is going to do to Emily? When she finds out what you've done, how you've destroyed her marriage, her security, everything we built together? Do you think she's going to thank you for this?" Now he was hitting closer to home, trying to find the weapon that would make me react, make me defend myself, make me break the silence that was clearly driving him toward madness. "She's going to hate you for this," he pressed on. "She's going to realize that her father is just a vindictive old man who couldn't stand to see her happy. She's going to choose me over you, and then you'll have nothing again. Nothing except your empty house and your pathetic little life." The boardroom was completely quiet except for Mark's heavy breathing. Everyone was watching me, waiting to see how I would respond to such a brutal personal attack. I simply reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out my phone. Without breaking eye contact with Mark, I pressed a single number and waited for it to connect. "Emily," I said softly when she answered. "Could you please come to the Ellis Technologies building? 32nd floor, conference room A. There's something important happening that you need to see." Mark's face went ashen as he realized what I was doing. "No," he whispered. "Don't drag her into this. This is between us." I ended the call and placed the phone back in my pocket. Then I looked directly at Mark and spoke the first words I'd addressed to him since revealing my identity. "She'll be here in 20 minutes," I said quietly. "Then we'll see which one of us she chooses to stand beside." The silence that followed wasn't just the absence of sound, it was the weight of inevitability, the crushing realization that Mark's carefully constructed world was about to collapse completely. And for the first time in 8 years, he was the one who couldn't find words to fill the void. 18 minutes later, Emily burst through the conference room doors like a woman racing against time. Her hair was disheveled from driving too fast, her cheeks flushed with worry and confusion. She looked around the imposing boardroom, at the expensive suits, the serious faces, the corporate power radiating from every polished surface, and her eyes found mine immediately. "Dad, what's going on? Your call scared me. You sounded so." She stopped mid-sentence as she noticed Mark slumped in his chair, his face gray and defeated. Mark? What's happening here? Before anyone could answer, her gaze swept the room again, taking in details she'd missed in her initial panic. The nameplate at the head of the table that read, Thomas Grant, Chairman. The stack of legal documents in front of me. The way everyone was looking at her with expressions of careful sympathy. I don't understand, she said slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. Helena Crawford stood gracefully. Ms. Ellis, perhaps you should take a seat. Your father has something to explain. But I shook my head gently. Actually, Helena, I think the situation speaks for itself. I looked at my daughter, this woman I'd raised to be strong and independent, and I felt a surge of profound love mixed with regret for the pain this revelation would cause her. Emily, I said quietly, I am the majority owner of Ellis Technologies as of yesterday afternoon. I purchased 51% of the company's shares over the past 6 months. She stared at me as if I'd spoken in a foreign language. You what? That's impossible. Dad, that would cost millions of dollars. You can't. Her voice trailed off as the implications began to sink in. Mark suddenly came to life, desperation giving him energy. Emily, this is what I've been trying to protect you from. Your father has been lying to you for years. All that poverty, all that struggling, it was all fake. He's been playing some sick game, watching us, planning this revenge. Mark. My voice cut through his rambling like a blade. Stop. The single word carried such authority that he immediately fell silent. For the first time since Emily had arrived, I stood up, and somehow the simple action commanded the entire room's attention. Emily, I continued, never taking my eyes off her face. Everything your husband just said is true, and everything he just said is wrong. She sank into the nearest chair, her hands trembling. I need you to explain this to me. All of it. Please. I do have money, a considerable amount. I've had it for years, long before your mother passed away. When she died, I made a choice to live differently, to discover what really mattered in life. I wanted to know who people truly were when they thought I had nothing to offer them. Mark made a sound of disgust. So this was all a test? Our entire marriage was some kind of experiment for your entertainment? I finally turned to look at him directly. No, Mark. This was never about testing anyone. This was about protecting my daughter from a man who measures human worth by bank account balances. The room was absolutely silent. Emily was staring at me with wide eyes, processing 8 years of memories through an entirely new lens. Every insult you threw at me. I continued, still addressing Mark. Every sneer, every moment you made Emily embarrassed of her father, those weren't tests. Those were revelations. They showed me exactly who you are when you think you have power over someone. I walked slowly around the table until I stood behind Emily's chair, placing my hands gently on her shoulders. But more importantly, they showed me who my daughter is. Despite years of pressure from you to be ashamed of me, despite your constant attempts to make her see me as a burden, she never once treated me with anything less than love and respect. She defended me when you attacked me. She visited me when you called me worthless. She held on to her principles when you tried to reshape them. Emily's shoulders began to shake, and I realized she was crying silently. Mark stood up suddenly, his face flushed with anger. So what now, Thomas? You destroy my company, humiliate me in front of my own board, and then expect Emily to thank you for it? You think money gives you the right to play God with people's lives? I looked at him with something that might have been pity. Mark, I'm not destroying anything. Ellis Technologies will continue to operate, probably more successfully than ever. The only thing that's ending today is your ability to hurt the people around you with impunity. I walked back to my seat and picked up a second folder I hadn't opened yet. Emily, I said gently, these are the papers for a house. Paid in full. It's in Millbrook, about 20 minutes from where I live. 3 bedrooms, beautiful garden, quiet neighborhood. The deed is already in your name. She looked up at me through her tears. Dad, I can't. I don't need. You don't need my money. I agreed. You never have. But you deserve choices. You deserve to know that you can build whatever life makes you happy, without worrying about financial security or depending on someone who doesn't treat you with the respect you've earned. Mark was staring at both of us now, his face cycling through emotions, rage, disbelief, something that might have been fear. "Emily," he said desperately, "you can't seriously be considering this. After everything we've built together, everything we've shared, you're going to let him tear us apart?" Emily stood slowly, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. When she spoke, her voice was steady and clear. "Mark, my father didn't tear us apart. You did that yourself, every time you chose cruelty over kindness, every time you measured people by their possessions instead of their character." She turned to face me fully. "Dad, I'm angry with you for lying to me. I'm hurt that you felt you couldn't trust me with the truth. But I understand why you did it. And I'm grateful, so grateful, to finally see everything clearly." The meeting ended quietly after that. Mark signed his severance papers without another word, his signature shaky and defeated. The board members filed out with murmured congratulations and promises of smooth transitions. Patricia Williams gathered her documents with professional efficiency. As Emily and I walked to the elevator together, she slipped her arm through mine, the same gesture she'd made as a little girl when we'd walk through the park on Sunday afternoons. "Dad," she said softly as the elevator descended, "when you called Emily earlier, did you know I would choose you?" I looked at my daughter's reflection in the polished elevator doors and smiled. "Sweetheart, you made that choice years ago. You just didn't know it yet." The doors opened on the ground floor, and we stepped out into the bright afternoon sunlight. Behind us, 32 floors up, Mark was probably still sitting in that boardroom, trying to understand how the powerless old man had turned out to be the most powerful person in the room. But that wasn't my concern anymore. My only concern was the strong, principled woman walking beside me, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that sometimes, just sometimes, patience and dignity triumph over arrogance and cruelty. The silence between us as we walked to our cars wasn't heavy or uncomfortable. It was peaceful, complete, and it was the sweetest sound I'd ever heard.